There's something unsettling about the idea of a crime being committed in complete darkness, especially when that darkness isn't just metaphorical but literal. In this case, the cellar room in the Ramsey home wasn't dim or low lit. It was blacked out entirely. No windows, no ambient light, nothing. So right away, it raises questions. Not just about visibility, but about the kind of person who would operate in that space without hesitation. And when you think about how even the homeowner himself had to fumble for a light switch, it makes you wonder, how did anyone else navigate it at all? Then you start peeling back the layers of the general basement layout. There are multiple areas, some with windows, some without, but none of them seem particularly well lit unless someone made an effort to flip a switch. And the house wasn't empty. People were asleep. So even if someone did move through that basement with a flashlight or a light source, you'd expect someone to notice, through a crack under a door, down a stairwell, something. But nobody seems to have seen anything. And that silence is either incredibly lucky or incredibly telling. Either way, it starts to sound less like chaos and more like control. And that's where all the psychological, physiological, and philosophical layers start to pile up. It's not just about whether someone could physically move through the space. It's about whether they could do it silently, efficiently, and emotionally detached. That starts to suggest familiarity, not randomness. Because when you remove light, you remove awareness. And only someone prepared for that would willingly choose it. So now the question isn't just who had access to the basement, but who felt comfortable enough to use it in the dead of night without flinching. So let's kind of start with the interviews and whatnot. In the 1997 interview with BPD, John Ramsey describes the basement as a place he rarely went to. The basement contains several distinct areas mentioned throughout the sources, including a train room or playroom where Burke played, a basement bathroom, and the wine cellar or cellar room or seldom used basement level storage room where JonBenet was discovered. Regarding the overall darkness, the sources indicate a significant difference between the general basement area and the specific cellar room where JonBenet was found. In the cellar room, according to John Ramsey in his 1997 BPD interview, this room is inherently a dark room. In his book, The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey recounts fumbling to flip the light on in the darkness when he discovered JonBenet. Similarly, in Burke Ramsey versus CBS, it is stated that Fleet White had previously opened the door to the wine cellar but did not turn on the light in the room. And when John Ramsey eventually found JonBenet, he turned on the light. Fleet White, as noted in the 1997 supplemental report by Linda Arndt, also stated that the interior of the wine cellar was dark and he did not see anything inside. This consistent description of darkness is supported by the fact that the cellar room itself had no windows, meaning it received no natural light at any time of day. This suggests that without an artificial light source, the cellar room would be pitch black regardless of whether it was day or night outside. First of all, the cellar room was completely dark and required artificial light. Let's think through this for a minute. When we say the cellar room was pitch black, we're not just talking about it being dim or shadowy. We're talking about total absence of natural light. No windows, no ambient street glow, no soft spill from hallway bulbs, just pure blackout. So from a physiological standpoint, that means your eyes are working with nothing, not even a chance to adjust or get used to the dark, which is something people often assume happens in every low light setting. But that only works when there is some light to work with. In complete darkness, your rods, those light sensitive cells in your eyes, are essentially blind. You're reaching around with zero visual data, relying fully on memory or touch. That's not just inconvenient, it's dangerous, especially in a cluttered, unfamiliar space. And if we're looking at this through the lens of basic logic, here's the question. Why would someone choose to commit a crime, particularly something as high risk as murder, in a location where they literally can't see what they're doing? Unless they brought a light source, they'd be operating blind. Which begs the next logical question, did someone bring a flashlight? And if so, why don't we have testimony or forensic evidence to suggest that? If there was light being used, wouldn't someone have noticed a flicker through a crack or at least mentioned it? The absence of reported light sources becomes its own kind of evidence. Now let's toss in some criminological theory. A lot of crimes, especially premeditated ones, hinge on opportunity, but also efficiency. Most offenders are trying to minimize risk, reduce noise, avoid visibility. They pick spaces that allow for control. But what's ironic here is that a pitch black, junk-filled basement is not an efficient space unless the person knows it like the back of their hand. That throws us into a psychological theory of familiarity. Did the perpetrator have practiced, lived-in knowledge of the space? If not, they'd risk injury, noise, and error. Imagine trying to navigate around bikes, boxes, and broken furniture in pitch black. It makes no sense unless you're confident in your spatial memory of that room. But let's not skip over the symbolic weight of darkness. In forensic psychology, total darkness is sometimes read as a metaphor: suppression, secrecy, psychological dissociation. If someone deliberately chose the cellar room, it might not just be for privacy. Maybe it reflected some mental disconnection, placing the act in a literal void. That kind of symbolic move isn't common for spontaneous or opportunistic criminals, though. That kind of symbolism tends to suggest internal conflict or a need to compartmentalize, traits associated with individuals closer to the victim, not strangers. Now, going back to John Ramsey's statement in The Other Side of Suffering, where he says he fumbled for the light, we have to ask, why wasn't the light already on? If anyone had been down there recently, wouldn't the switch still be flipped? That fumble tells us the room wasn't recently used or lit. And even more importantly, it reminds us that even he, the homeowner, wasn't naturally at ease in that room without light. That hesitation speaks volumes. And Fleet White? He opened the door and looked in, but didn't turn on the light. Now, isn't that a little odd? I mean, if you're looking for a missing child and you open a door into blackness, wouldn't your first instinct be to find a switch or at least call for help to investigate further? Unless you had an immediate gut reaction that it was too dark and too dangerous to walk into blindly. That instinct to avoid the room might suggest just how impenetrable the darkness was. Something else worth pointing out here is how darkness can affect our stress response. When visibility drops to zero, your body kicks into a mild fight or flight mode. Cortisol rises, breathing changes, your spatial awareness becomes hypersensitive. In other words, even if someone wanted to commit a crime in that space, their body would likely be working against them unless they were unusually calm or familiar. So again, this circles back to whether the person was confident and practiced in the space, or if the act was done under extreme emotional distress, which might override those physiological obstacles. Now think about it from a deductive standpoint. If we know the room was pitch black, and we know the victim was found staged in a very specific way, that tells us the perpetrator was either very methodical and prepared, or they turned on a light. But then we've got no mention of anyone seeing light coming from the cellar. No flickers, no sounds of switches, nothing. So either we're missing something or the crime wasn't done in the dark at all. It was done in the light, but under such conditions that no one else would notice. What's also funny is how people talk about the room like it's some ominous hideaway. The wine cellar, the basement storage room, as if it's just lurking back there waiting to be used for something sinister. And yet, John said he rarely went there. So here we are with a room nobody uses, nobody lights, nobody checks. But somehow, it becomes the central stage of one of the most high-profile crimes in America. That's not just coincidence. That's meaningful. Philosophically, it also raises the question of concealment versus confrontation. If someone chose a room where they couldn't even see what they were doing unless they turned on a light, was it to avoid confronting the reality of what they were doing? Darkness can be a psychological barrier. It removes accountability, both internally and externally. It's the difference between doing something in the full light of day and doing it in a void. That kind of setting tells us a lot about the mindset of the person involved. And maybe the biggest takeaway here is this: if the crime scene itself requires artificial light just to function, just to see, then either the crime wasn't committed in the cellar at all, or whoever did it brought their own light, left no trace of it, and managed to navigate an unfamiliar, hazardous, pitch black room with the precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going. And that's not random. That's intentional. Second of all, visibility in the basement was a known challenge even for familiar individuals. So here's the thing. John Ramsey himself, in multiple interviews, admits he had to turn the lights on to find his way around the basement. And this wasn't just once. He repeatedly brings up how dark it was, how cluttered it was, how you wouldn't want to be down there without lighting. That's not just some offhand comment. That's a clue about how the space functioned under normal conditions. If even the person who owns the house and has had years to build spatial familiarity still needs artificial lighting, then we're not just dealing with a dim space. We're dealing with a disorienting one. And that makes a big difference when we start asking what kind of person could or would move through there silently and deliberately. Now, the logic follows that if the homeowner himself hesitates in that space without lights, then a stranger or outsider would have it even worse. That's where deductive reasoning starts doing some heavy lifting. Let's say we know the basement is dark and cluttered, and even the father needs lights. Then any theory that involves someone unfamiliar committing a silent, efficient crime down there starts looking weaker and weaker. And the reason that matters is because the question becomes not just who could have done this, but who could have done it there under those conditions. What's interesting about that is how muscle memory and spatial awareness work. Familiarity with the space is like a built-in map your brain creates over time, based on how often you walk through it, how recently you navigated it, what objects have changed. But here's the thing, memory is only useful up to a point. If the layout is cluttered or shifting, say piles of Christmas stuff, bikes, junk, then your internal map isn't reliable anymore. Even someone familiar with the room still risks bumping into things, tripping, or making noise, and the body responds to that uncertainty with hesitation. You slow down, you reach out more often, you breathe differently. All of those tiny physiological cues work against stealth. Now, if someone didn't pause, if someone moved through that space confidently and quietly, that implies a high level of comfort. But not just comfort with the physical space, also comfort with the situation. That's kind of where criminology comes in. Crimes of opportunity often happen in places where the person feels safe or in control. If someone was navigating the basement effortlessly in darkness, that suggests it wasn't an improvisation. It was calculated, or at the very least, emotionally detached. And that kind of detachment is not usually seen in panic-driven strangers. Another thing that complicates this is the architectural design. We're not talking about one big open space. We're talking about sections, rooms, corners. Light from one area doesn't carry over to another. John even says a hall light might spill a little light into the basement if a door was open. But again, that's speculative at best. So in real terms, this basement was not one of those kind of dark but manageable spaces. It was a series of segmented, light-blocked areas. And that creates what you might call visual isolation. Each space becomes its own problem to solve. Let's not forget, too, how sensory deprivation can mess with you. In forensic psychology, there's a lot of talk about how reduced visibility increases stress, confusion, even disassociation. If you're navigating a silent, dark space under pressure, especially to commit a crime, your body's going to react unless you've done this before, or you feel emotionally numb. So when John says the lights weren't on unless accidentally, he's not just commenting on habit. He's describing an environment that actively resists being entered without effort. That adds another layer to how we frame the profile of whoever was down there that night. And maybe what's most telling is the way John talks about the basement in his later interviews. He doesn't speak about it like it's a casual or comfortable space. It's always described as a bit of a mess, a bit of a hazard, and kind of neglected. That's important because in most homes, people have safe zones and avoidance zones. The basement was clearly an avoidance zone. Not in the sense that it was never entered, but in the sense that it wasn't a place you casually wandered into without a reason. That kind of space naturally limits who would feel confident using it under pressure. What might be worth exploring is how this intersects with the idea of crime scene selection. In criminology, offenders typically choose locations where they either feel control or where visibility and exposure are minimized. Now, the basement does minimize exposure from the outside world, but only if you're already inside. So unless this person broke into the house and went directly down there in the dark, they'd have to navigate the house in the basement without detection, all while avoiding turning on a single visible light. That's asking a lot of any intruder scenario. Then again, if someone inside the house was involved, the basement's obscurity suddenly becomes an asset, not a liability. They'd know where things are. They'd know where not to step. They'd know which doors squeak or don't squeak. And they wouldn't need to guess whether anyone would hear them if they bumped into something. That level of spatial and psychological comfort shifts the entire interpretation of the crime scene. It stops looking like a random location and starts looking like a controlled stage. And philosophically, this goes deeper than just logistics. Spaces like basements carry psychological weight. They're hidden, they're beneath everything else, and they usually store things we don't want to deal with, literally and metaphorically. So when someone chooses that space, they're choosing invisibility. They're choosing separation from the rest of reality. That's not the kind of place someone stumbles into. That's the kind of place you go when you want to hide something, or when you want to make sure no one interrupts. Which brings us back to that core contradiction. If the basement was so dark and even the Ramseys didn't use it casually, how could someone just waltz down there at night, commit a complicated, deliberate act, and leave no sign of struggle, no noise, no trail of confusion? That's not randomness. That's someone operating with certainty, and maybe even emotional immunity. Because once you stop seeing a space as dangerous or inconvenient and start seeing it as useful, your whole mindset shifts. And whoever did this, their mindset wasn't just strategic, it was insulated. Third of all, I have my doubts about feasibility of a criminal navigating the basement without light. Here's where things start to stretch the limits of what's believable. If we're talking about a complete stranger or an outside intruder, the idea that someone could enter this unfamiliar house, find their way into a pitch-black basement filled with clutter, navigate it quietly, and carry out a crime like this without turning on a single light starts to feel improbable. I mean, let's just think practically. Even in your own house, walking into a dark basement feels risky. You slow down, feel the walls, maybe hesitate. Now imagine doing that in someone else's house in the dead of night, trying not to wake anyone up. It starts sounding less like a crime of opportunity and more like a fantasy someone wrote to sound convenient. And let's be real, darkness is not just an inconvenience, it's a liability. From a physiological perspective, you lose all peripheral awareness in full darkness, no depth perception, no ability to scan the environment. The visual cortex basically goes offline, and your brain has to switch into tactile and auditory modes. Your balance shifts, your gait slows, and your likelihood of bumping into something or making noise increases dramatically. So for someone to move confidently and silently in a space like that, either they were using a light and somehow left no evidence of it, or they knew the space intimately. There's really no middle ground there. What's also interesting is how this ties into classic forensic profiling. Most offenders don't take risks unless there's a reward they're targeting, or unless they're familiar enough with the terrain to reduce the risk. This basement doesn't scream reward. There's no obvious payoff for an intruder to choose that room. It's not close to the entrance, not close to the child's bedroom, and it's not the easiest place to flee from. It's a dead-end room, literally. That suggests that whoever used it either didn't plan to flee or didn't need to flee because they weren't supposed to be leaving at all. So maybe we ask, if someone did use a flashlight, where's the proof? Flashlights create beams, and beams leave reflections. Someone in the house might have noticed that from a crack in a door or a gap under a stairwell. And if it was a headlamp or anything with a battery, that raises questions about bringing tools into the house. Was there a backpack? Was anything recovered? And if no one noticed any foreign light source and there's no physical evidence of one, then maybe there wasn't one. Which takes us right back to square one. How did they see? Another possibility people throw out is night vision. But that veers into the absurd. Are we really entertaining the idea that someone broke into this home with military grade equipment and used it to navigate a toy filled, junk filled basement in silence? With no trace, no dropped items, no sounds, and then staged a body, applied a garrote, wrote a ransom note, all without being seen or heard? It borders on cinematic. And the thing about cinematic theories is they usually don't match real world crime scenes. Now, here's something else. Consider the emotional state of a person committing a crime like this. Fear, adrenaline, shock, those mess with your spatial processing. When you're under stress, your brain narrows its focus. You lose coordination. You're not efficient, especially not in the dark. So if this person wasn't calm and collected, they would have made noise, stumbled, left a trail. But if they were calm and collected, that suggests familiarity or detachment or both. And that's not what you'd expect from a random break-in gone wrong. What's funny is how often we underestimate how loud basements are. Wooden stairs creak, boxes shift, toys click when kicked. So even if someone did go down there, they'd have to move like a ghost. And not just move, commit a complex, intimate crime. That takes time. That takes proximity. That takes presence of mind. Darkness complicates all of those things. So unless someone had complete control of the space, mentally and physically, there's just no reason they'd pick that room. Now, if we flip this and say the person did turn on the light and just no one noticed, then we're assuming the rest of the household was either in a deep sleep or for some reason didn't hear or respond to anything. That opens a new can of worms. Why wouldn't someone wake up if lights were turned on in a dark, echo-prone basement? Did they not hear movement? Did no one stir? Or is it possible the light was on at some point and was turned off afterward by someone who knew exactly where that switch was? And this is where philosophy gets involved. What does it mean to commit an act in the dark? Metaphorically, darkness represents secrecy, denial, hidden motives. Choosing a pitch black space may reflect not just tactical thinking, but psychological intent to conceal, to suppress, to disassociate. That's not how most intruders operate. That's how someone with internal conflict, or deep shame, or deliberate concealment might behave. Someone who doesn't want to see what they're doing, or doesn't want it to be seen. Let's also not forget forensic staging. If this was about creating a story, say a kidnapping gone wrong, the cellar is a convenient place to hide the truth. It's out of sight, it's hard to access, it adds confusion. But to use it as a crime scene, that's different. That implies a decision to carry out the act there, not just dump a body. That decision carries weight. It says something about who the person was, how they viewed the act, and how much control they had in the moment. So in the end, we're left with a basic deductive position. If someone couldn't see, and there's no clear evidence that they had light, then they must have had familiarity. If they didn't have familiarity, then they would have left noise, signs of struggle, or evidence of panic. But we don't have that. What we have is a clean, controlled, concealed act in a completely dark space that practically no one entered casually. And that's not the fingerprint of randomness, that's the footprint of intent. The general basement area, in contrast to the cellar, the train room does have windows. In his 1997 BPD interview, John Ramsey describes the train room as having the only window that would let an entrance into the basement. Burke Ramsey versus CBS further details that this area had 3 sets of windows. However, despite these windows, the basement was still generally dark. In his 1997 BPD interview, John Ramsey stated he didn't remember any lights being on in the basement during his first trip down there on the morning of December 26th, and he concluded he would have had to see my way around. This implies that even during the daytime, natural light alone wasn't sufficient for clear visibility throughout the entire basement. When would one need to turn on a light in during the day, when for the cellar room, a light would always be necessary to see, as it has no windows and is described as inherently dark? And for the general basement area, while some natural light might filter in through the windows, it seems it was often insufficient. John Ramsey's comment about having had to see my way around suggests that even in the daytime, particularly if one needed to navigate through cluttered areas or into deeper sections, artificial light would be required. In his 1998 interview with Smith and Kane, John Ramsey mentions that the basement could get real hot in winter, and sometimes windows would be open to let cool air in. This implies that on some occasions there might be more natural light or air, but it doesn't negate the overall darkness, when at night, the sources clearly indicate that the basement would be extremely dark at night. In his 1998 interview, John Ramsey states that with the lights off at night, it would have been hazardous due to the lot of junk piled in there. He emphatically describes it as pitch black. It would have been tough. He explicitly states that lights were not at all unless it was just accidental in the basement at night, and that it would be tough to see without them. While navigating the entire house, John Ramsey notes in his 1998 interview that a hall light could provide some illumination probably in this area if the door was left open, but he still emphasizes the difficulty of seeing otherwise. This means for any significant activity in the basement at night, a flashlight or overhead light would be essential. John Ramsey's own account of breaking into the house via the basement window at night describes it as not easy and a struggle, even requiring him to take off his suit. While he later vaguely remembered being able to see real well during that incident, this could be attributed to memory vagueness or perhaps just enough ambient light from outside for navigation, rather than full visibility for activities like playing. So, my first point on this is that the limited visibility, even in the general basement area, is troublesome despite natural light. So, what's interesting here is that while people hear windows in the basement and immediately think, oh, okay, so there must have been light down there, the reality is a lot more nuanced. Just because there are windows doesn't mean there's usable light, especially if the windows are small, high up, partially blocked, or if it's early morning or late at night. And in this case, John Ramsey himself made it clear that even during the day, he had to turn on the lights just to get around. So even if sunlight trickled in, it wasn't enough to illuminate the entire area, particularly the deeper corners or behind storage and clutter. That paints a very different picture than what we typically imagine when we hear the word basement. Now think about what that means in practical terms. Let's say a kid wants to go downstairs to play with a train set. He's not going to stumble around in semi-darkness hoping to catch a glimpse of the tracks. He's going to flip the lights on. Same goes for an adult going down there to grab decorations or laundry. So if artificial light was necessary for normal household tasks, it becomes logical to assume it would also be necessary for something far more delicate or sinister. And that raises a major question. If someone used that basement to carry out a crime, how exactly were they seeing? From a physiological standpoint, low light visibility isn't just about how dark it is. It's about how long you've been in that environment and whether your eyes have had time to adjust. Even if a little light comes in from a window, your rods take 20 to 30 minutes to fully adapt to the dark. But that's assuming there's even enough light to work with. If the light is uneven, some spots bright, some in deep shadow, you actually get worse depth perception and contrast. So walking through a partially lit, cluttered basement without turning on the lights would be more disorienting than helpful. And here's where it starts getting more complicated: the layout itself. This wasn't one open room where you could see from one end to the other. It was segmented: train room, storage, laundry, bathroom, cellar. Each space had its own lighting, its own doorways, its own shadows. So even if a bit of daylight crept into one room, that doesn't mean it reached the rest. Moving from one zone to another would still plunge you into darkness unless you deliberately lit each space. Which makes you wonder, why wouldn't someone turn on the lights unless they were worried about being seen or heard? Let's run the scenario another way. If someone did turn on the lights and nobody noticed, that raises a different question. How deep was everyone sleeping? Are we assuming that someone was tiptoeing around, flipping switches, and no one stirred? Or are we underestimating how noticeable a flicker of light would be in a dark house at night? Light bouncing off walls, creeping under doors, even causing a slight electrical hum. It's not invisible. So either the lights weren't used or someone used them and knew how to do so without being detected. And both of those paths lead to someone familiar with the home. There's also a philosophical angle here. Light versus darkness isn't just practical, it's symbolic. Turning on a light means confronting reality. It means being fully present and exposed. Operating in half light or refusing to use a light source might suggest avoidance, denial, even emotional compartmentalization. If someone deliberately avoided light in a space where it was available, that might say more about their mental state than their tactical logic. Maybe they didn't want to see clearly, or maybe they didn't want to risk being seen clearly. Either way, it tells us something. Now think about how crime scenes are usually analyzed. Investigators are trained to look at not just what's there, but what's missing. So if there's a train room with light switches, but they weren't used, that absence becomes its own clue. If a space had visibility potential, but that visibility was never utilized, we have to ask why. Was it rushed? Was it intentional? Was it staged? And was the darkness part of the plan, or a side effect of someone trying to conceal something in a place they assumed no one would look? What's also funny is how the word train room makes it sound like this bright, cozy playroom. But from all descriptions, it sounds more like a converted basement space with storage, boxes, old furniture, maybe a rug rolled up somewhere. So we have to get that image out of our heads, the warm, playful environment, and replace it with something more realistic, dim, a little dusty, and visually confusing even with the windows. That changes how we imagine movement, planning, and intent. And here's something worth noting. Artificial light doesn't just help people see, it gives them spatial confidence. Once you flip a switch and the room lights up, your brain shifts. You move faster, you plan better, your stress levels drop. So someone refusing to use light in that basement is also someone choosing a slower, riskier, more stressful route. Unless, of course, they weren't stressed because they'd done this before, or because they were operating from a place of emotional detachment that overrode the need for clarity. This also ties back to criminological theories around environmental criminology, how offenders choose and navigate spaces. Most criminals don't choose environments that complicate their own movement. They prefer open paths, predictable lighting, low visibility from others, but good visibility for themselves. A basement like this fails that test unless the person using it had insider level knowledge of how to move through it safely and silently. And again, if even John Ramsey said he had to turn on lights to move around, it's hard to believe someone else didn't need to. So the bigger picture here is that natural light alone was never enough to make that basement functionally usable, especially not at night or in the deeper areas. The reliance on artificial lighting wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. And once you accept that, then you have to deal with the logical conclusion whoever was down there either used the lights and left no trace or didn't need them at all because they already knew where they were going. And either one of those paths brings us back to the same conclusion. This was someone with access, awareness, and intent. I might also add as a second point that there's this implausibility of a stranger operating undetected in the basement under the scenario described by the Ramseys. What's kind of wild when you actually stop and think about it is how much the intruder theory relies on this invisible stranger being able to move through the house like a ghost, completely undetected without waking anyone, and somehow familiar enough with the layout to retrieve very specific items from different rooms, and not just retrieve them, but use them in a way that aligns with the timeline, the crime scene staging, and the psychological detachment necessary to pull all of this off. That's not just unlikely, it's bordering on absurd. Like, it's one thing to say someone broke in, it's another to say they broke in, took their time, and managed all of this without tripping over a toy or bumping into a piece of furniture in a basement even the homeowner found difficult to navigate. Let's walk through this logically. For this theory to make sense, this person would have had to enter silently, either through a window well or another entrance, and then maneuver through multiple rooms in the dark, gathering materials like a pad and pen for the ransom note, a garrote fashioned from a paintbrush, and possibly even clothes from JonBenet's room. That suggests not just movement, but purposeful movement. You'd have to know where to go, what to grab, and how not to make noise while doing it. And here's the thing, that kind of precision doesn't just happen in an unfamiliar house. It's a level of control that implies prior knowledge, or at the very least, total confidence. Now, from a physiological perspective, stress hormones would be pumping like crazy if this were truly a break-in. Adrenaline affects your fine motor skills, your breathing, your vision. You're not steady, your hands might shake, your decision-making becomes impulsive, and yet we're expected to believe someone under that kind of pressure composed a multi-page ransom note, staged a crime scene, possibly redressed the victim, and then carried her into a pitch-black room at the far end of the basement, all while not waking anyone up or leaving forensic evidence that clearly proves their presence. It just doesn't line up with how human bodies react under duress. Also worth thinking about is the timeline. Crimes of opportunity are usually fast and chaotic, but this reads like someone took their time. The length of the ransom note alone suggests the person sat down, thought things through, maybe even paused. That's a huge risk to take inside a house where people are sleeping. The longer you're in, the higher your chances of being caught. So if this was a stranger, they were either irrationally bold or somehow knew with certainty that no one was going to interrupt them. And how would they know that? That kind of confidence doesn't make sense unless they felt psychologically secure in the space. What's funny is how much we overlook the absurdity of the idea that someone supposedly roamed the house, gathering items from multiple rooms, not just one. We're not talking about someone grabbing a weapon of opportunity from a single drawer. We're talking about someone going into JonBenet's room, possibly Burke's, maybe even the laundry area, taking their time to find things that would later show up in the staging. That's not random. That's intentional. And intention always narrows the field of suspects to people who knew what they were looking for. From a criminological standpoint, intruders tend to act within clear behavioral patterns. They're in and out. They don't linger in unfamiliar territory unless they're under the influence or extremely reckless. But this situation involves a level of deliberation that contradicts everything we know about typical home invasion behavior. Philosophically, that's worth digging into, because this wasn't just someone committing a crime, it was someone constructing a story, a narrative, something meant to send a message, mislead, or delay the discovery of truth. And strangers don't usually get that deep into narrative design. Now here's something else. If someone was in your house long enough to feed your child pineapple, write a note, redress the body, and move it across the house, are we really going to believe no one heard a thing? Not a creak, not a step, not the fridge door or the sink or a drawer opening. That's a lot of noise for a silent intruder. And again, if they were using a flashlight or the house lights, that's a whole other level of visibility that increases the odds of being caught. And yet nobody noticed. That silence says more than words ever could. We also have to think about the use of house-specific materials. The notepad, the pen, the paintbrush, the blanket, all of it belonged to the family. If the perpetrator brought their own tools, we'd expect them to take them when they left. But if they used the family's things, that points to either spontaneity or, again, familiarity. But here's the catch. Spontaneous crime with house-specific tools and detailed staging doesn't really go together. That's a contradiction. You can't have chaos and control existing in the same timeline unless someone's trying to script the chaos to look like randomness. What might be worth noting is the mental effort required to stage a crime scene while under threat of being discovered. It's not just about physical action. It's about maintaining a consistent logic that sells the narrative you're creating. And if someone pulled all this off without knowing the house, the family, or the habits of the people inside, then we're talking about an offender with an almost supernatural level of calm and precision. But if that's the case, why leave such a dramatic handwritten note behind? Why leave evidence? Why not get in and get out like any calculated criminal would? At some point, we have to entertain the possibility that the intruder theory isn't failing because of bias or speculation, but because it fundamentally doesn't hold up under even basic scrutiny. The logistics break down, the psychology doesn't fit, the timeline feels artificial, and the forensic implications don't support the story. It's almost like the intruder theory exists to give a clean explanation that distances the family from the horror, something that wraps the whole situation up in a way that spares people from having to look at the darker possibility. And maybe the darker possibility isn't just that the crime was committed by someone inside the house, but that it had to be. That everything about how the space was used, how the objects were gathered, how the body was handled, and how the story was constructed all point back to someone with knowledge, time, and confidence. Not someone who slipped in and out unnoticed, but someone who didn't need to slip at all, because they were never out of place to begin with. Additionally, you eventually start questioning whether the basement was the actual crime scene or a staging area. I mean, there has to be questions about this. Here's where things start to get a little twisted. Because if we're really thinking through the logistics of this basement setup, we have to ask whether the crime actually happened down there at all. Or was the basement just where JonBenet's body ended up? Because if the room is pitch black, cluttered, and not even regularly used, that might not be a place you commit a complex act like murder. It might be the place you use after the fact. A kind of dumping ground, a space meant to hide or delay discovery, which flips everything around. Suddenly, instead of the cellar being the scene of the crime, it's the scene of the cover-up. Think about it logically. If you were going to harm someone, especially a child, you're not doing it in a room where you can't see your hands in front of your face. And you're definitely not going to do it in a room where you have to stumble past junk and navigate a maze of clutter just to get in. That kind of environment doesn't lend itself to control. It lends itself to chaos. And if there's one thing the rest of the crime scene suggests, it's control, deliberate choices, careful movements. That doesn't match a spontaneous act in a pitch black room. And from a physiological angle, darkness creates serious limitations. If you're in a visually compromised setting, your other senses have to compensate, but that only works up to a point. You can't see injuries clearly. You can't stage a body with any kind of precision. You can't even gauge spatial proximity well enough to know if someone's watching from a corner. So either the person used a light or the act didn't happen there at all. That's the real dilemma. It's not whether the basement could conceal. It's whether it could accommodate what was done to JonBenet without compromising the act itself. What's also worth thinking about is how often in criminology bodies are moved. That's not unusual. People panic. People try to hide what happened. People try to manipulate the scene to tell a different story. And that makes sense here. The signs of staging are all over the case. The blanket, the pose, the tape and cord, all of it feels constructed. But if the act had taken place right there, you'd expect more disruption, more evidence of struggle, more noise, more mess. Instead, it's quiet, tidy almost. That's the red flag. When something looks too placed, it probably is. And then there's the timeline. If JonBenet was killed elsewhere in the house and then moved, that might explain why so many items used in the crime came from different locations. The paintbrush from one area, the note from another, the clothing, the blanket, it's a scavenger hunt through the house. That makes more sense if the person was walking room to room before moving the body. Because if the act happened in the basement, you'd expect everything to already be there. But instead, we see a series of deliberate trips, like someone was assembling a story. What's funny, in a sad way, is how the idea of the basement being the crime scene sort of stuck early on. Like once the body was found there, that must have been where everything happened. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes the discovery location is completely separate from the origin. And when you apply that kind of lens here, the behavior of the person responsible starts to look less impulsive and more strategic. They weren't just trying to hide the body. They were trying to frame the environment, to direct attention toward one narrative and away from another. So then you have to look at motive, not just motive for the crime itself, but motive for using the basement. What does the cellar accomplish? It buys time. It creates confusion. It removes the act from the more intimate parts of the house, like the bedroom or the hallway. And philosophically, that's meaningful. It's a distancing technique. It's a way to separate the violence from daily life, to take something horrific and physically push it into the deepest, darkest part of the home. That's not just concealment. That's psychological compartmentalization. And if you're staging a crime, you're not just thinking about how to hide it, you're thinking about what it should look like. That's the heart of forensic framing. And in this case, everything about the scene in the basement seems designed to suggest a certain type of story, a kidnapping gone wrong perhaps, or a hidden intruder. But when you look at how many house-specific items were used, how unlikely it is that anyone could operate in total darkness, and how composed the scene looks, the staging starts to unravel. It's trying too hard to tell one story, which makes you start wondering what it's trying to cover up. Another thing to consider is the emotional aspect. People who move bodies after a crime don't always do it because they want to hide the act. Sometimes it's about shame, sometimes it's about fear, sometimes it's about regret. And if this was someone close to JonBenet, moving her might have been about not being able to face what just happened. Moving her to the cellar becomes symbolic, out of sight, out of mind. That's not something an intruder does. That's something someone emotionally entangled does. What might be worth remembering here is that crime scenes aren't just physical, they're psychological. They reflect the mindset of the person behind them. So when we see a body in a dark basement corner, under a blanket, surrounded by carefully selected house objects, what we're seeing is an expression of control, fear, and probably guilt. That's not the signature of a random outsider. That's the imprint of someone who knew her, knew the house, and knew what they wanted us to believe. So at the end of the day, maybe the most telling detail isn't what was found in the basement, but how it got there. And why? Because once you stop seeing the cellar as the place where it happened and start seeing it as the place where it was presented, the logic shifts. The story changes, and so does the list of people capable of pulling it off. It stops being about breaking in and starts being about what someone inside was trying to bury. Could someone be playing in the basement in the daytime and not need a flashlight or a light versus at nighttime they would need one? Given the descriptions, daytime it's plausible that Burke or any child could play in the train room during the daytime without needing a flashlight, as it has windows that let in some light. However, if they ventured beyond this specific area into other parts of the basement, especially the windowless cellar, or if the train room itself was particularly cluttered or deep, a light might become necessary for better visibility and safety, as suggested by John Ramsey's own need to turn on lights to see my way around. In nighttime, for playing or any activity in the basement at night, a light would almost certainly be required. John Ramsey's descriptions of it being pitch black and hazardous due to junk make it clear that unassisted navigation, let alone playing, would be very difficult and unsafe without artificial illumination. Going back to this idea of limited daytime visibility and safety concerns even for play, what's rarely talked about is how visual perception depends not just on light itself, but on contrast, the difference between objects and their backgrounds. During the day, a little natural light might come into the basement, sure, but if that light scatters unevenly or hits walls instead of illuminating the floor, it becomes harder, not easier, to distinguish where one object ends and another begins, especially in a space cluttered with dark-colored furniture, cardboard boxes, and scattered toys. Low contrast lighting creates the perfect condition for accidents. Not just for kids, but for anyone. There's also something subtle that happens when kids use a space like that. They start assigning emotional boundaries to their environment. Maybe the area closest to the stairs feels safe, but past a certain line, maybe where the windows stop or where it gets too quiet, it starts to feel off limits. Not because someone told them that, but because their bodies and instincts are reading the cues. Lighting plays a major role in that. Inconsistent brightness can make certain corners feel eerie or off. That creates natural limits in a child's mind about where they'll actually play, even during the day. And clutter, especially in partial light, becomes visually deceptive. A toy train track might look like a safe flat surface until you're right on top of it and realize it's curved or broken. A stack of boxes might blend into the background until you turn quickly and clip your shoulder on it. Even in the daytime, when the eye should have the advantage, the layout of that basement would have worked against you. Vision isn't just about light, it's about clarity, and this space didn't offer much of that. There's also the issue of environmental fatigue. Spaces that require constant vigilance, watching your steps, squinting to make things out, create mental strain. And that's a huge problem if we're imagining a kid trying to play freely down there. You're not going to lose yourself in imaginative play if you're constantly having to step carefully, look over your shoulder, or freeze every time you hear a creak. The basement wasn't just dim, it was mentally demanding. That type of space kills spontaneity. It makes play feel more like navigating a minefield. We also tend to underestimate how light affects the tone of a space. Brightness can make a place feel warm, open, even joyful, but low light can add a heaviness and almost subconscious pressure. When a room stays visually heavy during the daytime, when even sunlight can't lift the shadows, that has an emotional impact. It's not just a place where toys are. It starts to feel like a place where we store things, where movement is restricted, where people don't linger unless they have to. And here's something that rarely gets mentioned. In dim or inconsistent lighting, time feels different. The basement may have felt like it swallowed time, where minutes stretched out, where you couldn't tell if it was 2 p.m. or 6 p.m. because the environment didn't reflect the outside world. That temporal disconnection can actually influence decision making. It's harder to gauge urgency. That matters because anyone down there, especially a child, might not have felt anchored to the flow of the day. That sense of timelessness could contribute to both confusion and miscommunication. Spatial orientation would have also been a challenge. Without clean lines, open sight paths, or a consistent lighting scheme, the human brain struggles to create a reliable internal map. You don't just know where things are, you have to constantly reassess. That slows everything down. You hesitate more. You check twice. In an emergency, that disorientation becomes dangerous. Even during routine activity, it introduces risk. If that basement had been called upon to function as a safe, usable play space, it fundamentally failed that role. There's also something important about how light interacts with noise. Dim spaces make sounds feel louder. They echo more, or at least seem to, because your senses are on high alert. So if a child is playing in a half-lit basement and hears a thud or footstep, that sound is going to feel more intrusive. That kind of environment doesn't support immersion or peace of mind. It fosters tension. And kids pick up on that whether they can articulate it or not. From a behavioral standpoint, most families tend to avoid areas that aren't visually welcoming. Even without ever saying it aloud, households silently categorize their rooms. This is the space we relax in. This is where we store things. This is where we avoid unless we need something. If the basement was dark and cluttered even by day, it likely fell into that third category. And that tells us a lot about who would or wouldn't be using it and why. Philosophically, a space like that becomes more than just a physical setting. It becomes a boundary between the seen and the unseen. The upper floors of the house are full of natural light, daily activity, family memories. The basement, on the other hand, becomes the repository of things people don't want to deal with. Old boxes, forgotten toys, maybe even psychological baggage. So when a child descends into that space, they're not just stepping into a room. They're crossing into a different emotional register. One that's less secure, less sacred, and definitely less supervised. What might be worth reflecting on is how these environmental details shape what we consider possible or plausible in this case. Because if the space was hard to use for play, even in daylight, it becomes even harder to imagine it being used smoothly for a complex, silent, emotionally loaded act without visibility. The basement, as described, just didn't offer the kind of physical or emotional conditions that support that kind of activity, unless the person involved knew it intimately and had a very specific reason to rely on its obscurity. Remembering then that nighttime use of the basement was inherently dangerous without light and would be the same for the criminal. It's just not a good place to commit a crime. There's something about nighttime that changes how we interact with space, especially in a house. A room that feels fine during the day suddenly becomes off limits or even eerie when the lights are off. The brain processes familiar spaces differently in the dark, leaning on memory instead of sight, and that memory has to work harder in cluttered or unstructured environments. Now take that basic truth and apply it to the Ramsey basement, a space already described as disorganized, packed with random objects and dim even in daylight. Once the sun went down, that room wouldn't just be hard to navigate, it would be intimidating even to someone who lived there. And it's not just about how dark it was, it's about how many decisions had to be made in that darkness. Do you walk forward or turn back? Do you feel for the light switch or risk tripping over something? The moment you step into a pitch black room, especially one with no ambient light, no windows, and no clearly defined path, you're making a series of micro judgments that slow you down and increase your risk. That's true even if you're trying to find a Christmas box. Now imagine trying to hide a body in that same darkness and do it quietly. That's not just risky, it's unmanageable without some kind of visual aid or deep spatial familiarity. One overlooked detail is that human vision isn't just less effective at night, it's actually working against you in total darkness. Your pupils dilate, your brain heightens other senses, and your perception of depth gets warped. You can't reliably judge distance, angles, or even object identity. That's why we bump into in the dark or misjudge a doorway. In a basement full of obstacles, that lack of visual data wouldn't just be a nuisance, it would be a liability. The odds of a stranger operating without incident in that kind of environment fall apart fast under basic physiological scrutiny, and that's assuming this person wanted to be in the dark. Let's take a step back. If someone were in that basement at night with ill intent, they'd have to be either extremely careless or extremely confident. Careless in the sense that they'd risk waking the household by bumping into something, stepping on a toy, or making noise. Or confident. Confident that no one would wake up, confident that they wouldn't need a light, and confident that they could navigate the space with precision. And that kind of confidence doesn't come from guesswork. That's the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the space. Now, what's interesting is how darkness changes the psychology of a setting. It doesn't just obscure visibility, it amplifies uncertainty. People behave differently when they can't see. Their decisions become more cautious, more reactive. There's less room for improvisation. So if a crime was committed or staged in the basement at night, and we're assuming the perpetrator didn't use a light, they were operating under conditions that make basic motor coordination difficult and careful staging nearly impossible. Unless, again, they weren't a stranger. Another layer to this is how light, or the lack of it, affects sound. In the dark, people move differently, and not always more quietly. You might think you're being cautious, but you're also hyper aware of every sound you make. The floor creaks feel louder, the rustle of clothes feels suspicious. That kind of auditory tension isn't conducive to a smooth operation. If someone's moving around the basement at night, making multiple trips, manipulating objects, and doing all this in silence, it doesn't fit with how people actually function in unlit, unpredictable environments. There's also this very human instinct to avoid dark places when we don't need to be in them. We don't like going down into unlit basements unless absolutely necessary, even during the day, let alone at night. It's not fear in the dramatic sense, it's risk assessment. We know we can fall, get hurt, get turned around, and that's in our own homes. So the idea that an outsider would voluntarily choose a pitch black, chaotic basement to commit or conceal a crime just doesn't fit what we know about normal human behavior. And if the lights were turned on, well, that's another problem. Light leaks. It bounces off surfaces. It creeps under doors and glows through vents. In a house where people were supposedly asleep, that light would have been noticeable, or at least mentionable. Yet we don't hear much about that. So either the person used a light and no one saw, or they didn't use one at all. And if it's the latter, then we're being asked to believe someone performed a highly sensitive task in complete sensory deprivation without slipping up once. That's not strategy. That's fiction. Philosophically, night acts as a kind of permission slip for denial. We associate the absence of light with secrecy, with emotional detachment, even with moral ambiguity. Darkness gives a false sense of cover, of being outside time or consequence. If the person chose the basement at night, maybe it wasn't just to hide from others. Maybe it was to hide from themselves, to create psychological distance from what they were doing. That kind of detachment isn't common in random crimes. It's personal, it's internal. It's often rooted in shame or panic. Criminology also tells us that offenders rarely choose needlessly complex environments unless they're forced to, or unless they know the setting so well that the complexity disappears for them. In that case, the space doesn't feel complicated. It feels navigable, almost natural. That reframes everything. It means the basement at night wasn't a liability to them. It was a buffer zone, a strategic area they knew others in the house avoided, especially when it was dark. That's not luck. That's insight. What's worth taking away here is that the entire foundation of this theory, someone navigating the basement at night without light, relies on an unrealistic level of ability, stealth, and nerve. It ignores what darkness does to the body. It ignores how sound and movement behave differently in that space. And it ignores how unlikely it is that a stranger could do all of this without being noticed. Once you strip away the guesswork, all you're left with is a very controlled act in a very uncontrollable environment, which only makes sense if the person was never out of place to begin with. Lastly, there's just no way a criminal is operating in that environment without light. There's a difference between unlikely and unreasonable. And this idea that a stranger managed to carry out a multi-step crime in a pitch-black cluttered basement with no lighting tips into the realm of unreasonable pretty quickly. Not just because it's dark, but because of how much was supposedly done in that darkness. It's not just sneaking in. It's locate the victim, assemble staging materials, potentially write a ransom note, redress a child, create a ligature device, and maneuver the body through narrow pathways, all without flipping a switch or dropping anything. That's not a typical criminal act. That's a performance. And a performance like that in a space that difficult with that little visibility, it's a hard sell. It's also worth zooming in on the act of finding specific objects in the dark. If this was someone unfamiliar with the house, how would they know where to find a paintbrush to break? Or which blanket to use? Or where the light switches even were? Let alone how to avoid triggering any squeaky floorboards or visible hall lights. That's where logic just falls apart. To move intentionally through someone else's private home without light, pick up materials from different rooms, and leave no trail suggests either superhuman luck or familiarity that runs deeper than just having scoped out the house. And forget elaborate crime for a second. Just try to imagine stepping into a basement like that with zero visibility and thinking, yes, this is where I'll commit this act. Not where I'll panic, not where I'll run, not where I'll try to get out of as quickly as possible, but where I'll stay long enough to orchestrate something that includes redressing and staging a child's body. That's not random. That's deeply intentional. And intention in criminology is usually paired with access, knowledge, and psychological distance from the consequences. From a sensory processing standpoint, the lack of lighting doesn't just make physical movement difficult, it messes with your spatial logic. You can't perceive direction, you can't find edges, and your brain can't accurately judge height, width, or distance. That means every step is a calculated risk. And if you're trying to carry a body or position something carefully, you're working against your body's natural limitations. So how do you do all of that silently, quickly, and with no damage to yourself or the scene? Either you had light or you didn't need it because you already knew where everything was. What's also fascinating is how quiet the whole scene reportedly was. Nobody heard anything. No furniture moving, no banging, no doors creaking open. But think about the basement as it's been described, crammed, chaotic, noisy underfoot. Now imagine someone unfamiliar trying to navigate that with the dexterity of a stagehand. It's like trying to move through a jungle gym blindfolded without knocking anything over. The silence itself starts to tell a story, and that story doesn't match what we'd expect from an outsider under pressure. We tend to forget that stress limits precision. An intruder moving through unfamiliar territory in the dark would be in a heightened physiological state, heart racing, hand sweating, focus narrowed. That's not the frame of mind for slow, careful staging. That's when people make mistakes, drop things, or freeze up. But here we see very specific decisions. Staging, object placement, a written note. That's not panic. That's control. And again, control doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's the product of comfort or detachment or both. There's also this element of absurdity in expecting the same person to create a sophisticated, composed crime scene while making no noise, using no lighting, and somehow not waking anyone in the house. If someone really did all that in silence and darkness, then what are we talking about here? A ninja? A magician? Because that's the level of implausibility we're being asked to entertain. And when a theory demands that kind of precision without the right tools, it stops being theory. It becomes narrative. The absence of light doesn't just challenge movement, it challenges memory. Even if the person had visited the house before, the cluttered layout and seasonal disorganization would have changed since their last visit. Boxes would have been moved, gifts added, items shifted. That breaks any mental map the person might have relied on. So unless they had recent personal access to the home, living access, there's no way they could have operated with that kind of seamless motion. And there's a moral framing here too, in how light functions in storytelling and human behavior. Light exposes, darkness conceals. So someone choosing not to use light is also, in a way, choosing not to confront. Maybe not just avoiding being seen, but avoiding seeing what they're doing. That's not just a tactical move, it's emotional insulation. Darkness here becomes a shield from accountability. And that only makes sense if the person committing the act has something to emotionally protect themselves from. Criminologically, when someone commits a complex act in a difficult environment and it's pulled off without errors, it points to practice, not chance. The cleaner the act, the more embedded the actor usually is in that environment. So if there was no light, no mess, no noise, and no confusion, then you're looking at someone who wasn't operating from the outside in. They were working from the inside out. That doesn't just change the suspect pool, it changes the entire shape of the case. What might be worth really sitting with is the idea that this was never meant to be seen as a clean crime. It was meant to feel chaotic like an intruder did it. But ironically, it's too clean for chaos. It's a contradiction hidden in plain sight. The messiness of the staging doesn't match the supposed difficulty of the space. And once that clicks, the illusion breaks. The basement wasn't a chaotic battlefield for a desperate stranger. It was a carefully chosen canvas for someone trying very hard to mislead. And the absence of light wasn't an obstacle. It was the point. Okay, so let's think about this as we start to close this out. When sitting with all of this for a minute, the layout, the darkness, the silence, the absence of light evidence, it starts to chip away at the idea of some unknown intruder slipping through the night like a ghost. The more you break it down, the more it starts to look like whoever did this didn't just know the house, but knew how to move inside of it without making a sound. That's not a stranger. That's someone who understood the rhythms of that house, someone who felt familiar with where things were, even in the dark. And what's interesting is that darkness in this context becomes more than just a condition. It becomes a choice, a setting, maybe even a tool. That's where the philosophical and criminological threads intersect. Because darkness doesn't just hide physical acts, it hides intention. It distances the person from what they're doing, it insulates them. And if someone used that basement, used that cellar without needing light, without fumbling or making noise, well, that's not just efficient, that's personal, that's psychologically loaded. What might be worth noting as the real thread running through all this is that visibility, who could see what, when, and how, turns out to be one of the most important clues in the entire case. It tells us something about comfort levels, decision making, spatial awareness, and intent. And when you stack those clues against the realities of pitch black rooms and cluttered paths, the story of a random break-in starts to fall apart. What's left is something colder, something quieter, and maybe something much closer to home. And as always, I appreciate you for watching. Shout out to the video sponsors and whatnot, those who are giving monetarily. Like I said before, man, you don't have to do it, but you do. And I really, truly appreciate that. Thank you for those who comment, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. And until next time, take it easy.